The Second World War ended with celebration, but behind the parades and flags there was unease. For 4 years, the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in the most desperate struggle in human history. American ships had carried weapons across the Arctic to Murmansk. Soviet armies had borne the heaviest losses against Hitler. American and Soviet soldiers had shaken hands at the Elbe. The alliance had been real, forged in blood, but it was always uneasy. Both sides fought a common enemy, yet neither forgot that their systems, their values, and their visions of the future were profoundly different. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was not simply restored to peace. It was broken and reordered. Europe lay in ruins, cities bombed to rubble, millions displaced. Two powers stood above the wreckage: the United States, untouched at home, wealthy, armed with the new weapon of atomic fire, and the Soviet Union, victorious through sacrifice. Its land scarred, but its armies triumphant, its influence stretching deep into the heart of the continent. The question was not whether these two giants would shape the future, but how they would coexist. The first cracks appeared even before the war ended. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to decide the fate of post-war Europe. They smiled for photographs, but beneath the surface lay suspicion. Stalin wanted secure borders and friendly governments on his western frontier. He remembered the invasions of 1914 and 1941, the rivers of blood that had flowed into Russia. He would not allow such vulnerability again. Roosevelt and Churchill spoke of self-determination, of free elections, of democratic principles, but they too thought in terms of spheres of influence. The words were lofty, but the meaning was power. When the conference at Potsdam followed in the summer, the tone had hardened further. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by Truman, who had little trust in Stalin. Churchill was soon replaced by Attlee. But the mistrust remained. The United States had tested the atomic bomb, and Truman let Stalin know, half as warning, half as boast. Stalin listened, unmoved. He already knew from his spies that such a weapon existed, and he was determined that the Soviet Union would build its own. In that room of victors, the seeds of the Cold War were planted. Germany became the first battleground of the new rivalry. The country was divided into zones, occupied by Americans, British, French, and Soviets. In theory, it was to be governed jointly, rebuilt together. In practice, each side shaped its zone according to its vision. In the West, steps toward a market economy and democratic institutions were taken. In the East, the Soviets dismantled factories, shipped equipment to Russia, and began building a socialist state under their control. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, but also divided, became the most visible symbol of this division, a city where the two systems stared each other in the face. To the Americans, the expansion of Soviet power looked like aggression. Eastern Europe, from Poland to Bulgaria, seemed to be falling under Stalin's grip. Governments that had once been diverse were now dominated by communists, often after purges and intimidation. Washington read these moves as the start of an empire, a creeping takeover of half the continent. To Moscow, these were defensive measures. Twice in a generation, Germany had attacked, supported by Western capital. The Soviet Union would not allow hostile regimes on its borders. Every revolution in Eastern Europe, Stalin believed, was a fortress wall against future invasion. The clash was not only about geography, it was about visions of the future. The United States emerged from the war confident, its economy booming, its culture radiating outward. Americans spoke of democracy, free markets, and open societies. The Soviet Union emerged proud, but scarred, its people hardened by unimaginable loss, its leaders convinced that capitalism was hostile, and that only a centrally planned, disciplined system could ensure survival. To each side, the other represented not just competition, but danger. The atomic bomb cast its shadow across this fragile peace. In August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki revealed a new scale of destruction. For the United States, the weapon was a guarantee of superiority, a deterrent to any Soviet ambition. For the Soviets, it was a challenge, a reminder that they must catch up or be vulnerable. Even before the ashes cooled in Japan, the arms race had begun. American officials believed their monopoly would last for decades. Stalin was determined it would not last even 5 years. In the first months after victory, American public opinion was still hopeful. Newspapers printed stories of cooperation, of rebuilding, of the United Nations as a forum for peace. But underneath, doubt spread. Reports came from Eastern Europe of rigged elections, censorship, and arrests of opposition. Diplomats described Soviet behavior as inflexible, suspicious, unwilling to compromise. The term Iron Curtain, first used by Churchill in private, would soon become the common metaphor. In Moscow, the tone was no softer. The Soviet press depicted the United States as imperialist, intent on dominating the world with its wealth and its bomb. Propaganda spoke of capitalist encirclement, of spies, of plots to overthrow socialism. Stalin told his people that vigilance was needed, that enemies were everywhere. The celebration of victory was brief, soon replaced by the tightening of control, the rebuilding of defenses, the preparation for another struggle, this time against former allies. The story of the early Cold War is the story of trust collapsing almost as soon as it was declared. Agreements at Yalta and Potsdam, which had promised cooperation, turned into points of accusation. Germany, meant to be unified, became divided. Eastern Europe, promised free elections, became one-party states. The atomic bomb, meant to end a war, became the symbol of a new one. By the end of 1946, the illusion of alliance was gone. What remained were two visions of the world, standing face to face, each convinced that the other threatened its survival. For the United States, the lesson was that Soviet power must be checked before it spread. For the Soviet Union, the lesson was that only strength and discipline could protect socialism from the capitalist enemy. The war that had ended in triumph had birthed another, colder conflict. It was not fought with open battles, at least not yet, but with words, with suspicions, with strategies. The soldiers at the Elbe had clasped hands in victory, but their countries were already moving apart, preparing for a struggle that would last not 4 years, but 4 decades. In the spring of 1947, a single speech in Washington marked a turning point in world history. President Harry Truman stood before Congress and declared that the United States would support free peoples everywhere who were resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The language was broad, almost vague, but the meaning was clear. America would no longer retreat into isolation. It would confront the spread of communism wherever it appeared. This was the Truman Doctrine, and it was the declaration that the Cold War had truly begun. The immediate context was Greece and Turkey. In Greece, a civil war raged between the government, supported by Britain, and communist partisans, supported indirectly by Yugoslavia and with sympathy from Moscow. Britain, exhausted by the war and nearly bankrupt, announced it could no longer provide aid. Without help, Greece seemed likely to fall into communist hands. Turkey, strategically controlling the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, was also under pressure from Soviet demands. Truman presented the choice starkly. If America did not step in, communism would spread unchecked, and the free world would be in danger. Congress responded with approval, granting funds and setting the precedent. The doctrine was more than aid to two countries. It was a philosophy of containment. From now on, every local conflict would be viewed through the lens of East versus West. The old alliances of the war had dissolved into suspicion, and the United States now declared openly that it would oppose the Soviet Union not only with words, but with money, weapons, and political commitment. For Moscow, Truman's speech was confirmation of what Stalin had long believed. The capitalist world was organizing against socialism. The rhetoric of cooperation at the United Nations was a facade. In private meetings, Soviet officials described the doctrine as an attempt to encircle the Soviet Union, to create a cordon of hostile states. Propaganda denounced it as imperialism dressed up as freedom. Stalin responded not with immediate confrontation, but with a tightening of control over Eastern Europe. The year 1947 brought another weapon into the field of this new war: money as strategy. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a vast program of economic aid to rebuild Europe. Factories, railways, farms, all devastated by years of bombing and occupation, would be restored with American funds. Officially, it was humanitarian, an effort to lift the continent from ruins. Unofficially, it was a political act, designed to prevent communism from gaining appeal in societies desperate for bread and work. Hungry people, Washington reasoned, might turn to Moscow's promises. Prosperous people would prefer democracy. The Marshall Plan was offered to all of Europe, including the Soviet Union and its allies. But Stalin saw it as a trap. To accept American money would mean opening the Soviet economy to Western oversight. It would mean influence, and influence meant weakness. He forbade Eastern European governments from participating, even those that were tempted, such as Czechoslovakia. Instead, in 1947, he created the Common Form, a body to coordinate communist parties across Europe, ensuring that their loyalty to Moscow was absolute. The refusal of the Marshall Plan deepened the divide. In the West, nations that accepted aid began to recover rapidly. France and Italy, once vulnerable to communist parties, saw their economies stabilize. In the East, the Soviet model hardened. National economies were yoked to central plans, tied to Moscow's needs, cut off from Western investment. The continent, that had once been one theater of war, was now clearly divided into two camps. Berlin became the flashpoint of this division. The city, divided into sectors, became a microcosm of the Cold War. In 1948, when Western authorities introduced a new currency in their zones to stabilize the economy, the Soviets reacted by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to the western half of the city. Berlin was blockaded, a test of wills. If the Western powers abandoned their sectors, it would be a victory for Stalin. If they tried to break the blockade by force, war might follow. The American response was audacious. Instead of fighting on the ground, they took to the air. Planes began flying into Berlin day and night, carrying food, coal, medicine, everything needed to keep 2 million people alive. At first it seemed impossible, but the airlift grew into a vast operation, with flights landing every few minutes, round the clock, for nearly a year. The people of Berlin watched as candy bars were dropped by parachute for children, as coal sacks arrived to heat their homes, as the Western powers proved that they would not be forced out. The blockade ended in 1949, a humiliation for Stalin. He had tested the resolve of the United States and its allies, and they had stood firm. The airlift became a symbol, a demonstration that the West would defend its positions, not through surrender, but through ingenuity and determination. For the people of America, it was proof that containment could work. For the people of the Soviet Union, it was portrayed as propaganda, but privately, it showed that the Americans were not to be underestimated. By this time, alliances had hardened into institutions. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, binding the United States, Canada, and Western Europe into a military pact. The logic was simple: an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. It was the clearest signal yet that the world was divided into two camps, each preparing for the other. Stalin denounced NATO as aggression, but he had no equivalent organization yet. That would come later. For now, his answer was to clamp down tighter on Eastern Europe, to make sure no government wavered, no people drifted toward the West. In the United States, the doctrine of containment became the lens through which every event was interpreted. A strike in Italy was seen as communist influence. An election in France was judged by whether Moscow would gain. Even revolutions far from Europe, in Asia or the Middle East, were viewed as moves on the chessboard. The American public, once weary of foreign entanglements, now accepted that their country was the leader of the free world, locked in struggle with a rival ideology. For the Soviet Union, the years of 1947 to 1949 were years of consolidation. Stalin tightened his grip at home, purged potential rivals, and used propaganda to cast America as the new fascist, a state bent on dominating the world. He insisted that socialism was encircled, that vigilance was essential. Soviet citizens were told that the West sought their destruction, that only loyalty and sacrifice could preserve the revolution. The two sides were no longer allies who had fought together against Hitler. They were opponents, staring at each other across a divided Europe, testing each other's resolve, probing for weakness. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan had made America the active leader of the Western camp. The blockade of Berlin and the creation of the Common Form had made clear the Soviet determination to hold the East. The Cold War had moved from suspicion to open confrontation, not with guns fired in anger, but with strategies, speeches, and the drawing of lines that would last for decades. By the end of the 1940s, the world was no longer in doubt. The alliance of war had become the confrontation of peace. The shadow of rivalry stretched from Berlin to Washington to Moscow. And both sides understood that this was not temporary. It was the new order of the world. By the year 1949, the lines of the new conflict were clear. The Second World War had ended only a few years earlier, yet the optimism of victory had already faded. In its place stood suspicion, rivalry, and a spreading sense of fear. The Cold War was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. One of the greatest shocks came in August of 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. Until that moment, American leaders had believed that their monopoly on nuclear weapons would last for decades. Scientists had estimated that the Soviets were too far behind, too devastated by war to succeed so quickly. But Stalin had mobilized every resource, drawn on espionage networks that had penetrated the Manhattan Project, and driven his scientists with relentless urgency. The explosion in Kazakhstan shattered the illusion of safety. Now both superpowers possessed weapons of unimaginable destruction. For the United States, the loss of nuclear monopoly transformed the atmosphere. Suddenly, every city seemed vulnerable. The image of Soviet bombers crossing the Arctic filled newspapers. Civil defense drills began. School children crouched under desks in practice for an attack that might incinerate entire cities. Fallout shelters were built, sirens tested, families taught to store food. The new age was not only military, it was psychological, a constant tension woven into daily life. In Washington, the fear was sharpened by events in Asia. In October of 1949, Mao Zedong's forces triumphed in China, creating the People's Republic, the largest communist state on earth after the Soviet Union. For American policymakers, it seemed as if communism was advancing on multiple fronts, spreading like wildfire from Europe to Asia. The domino theory began to take shape, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow. The Cold War was no longer limited to Europe, it was global. The eruption of war in Korea in June of 1950 confirmed these fears. When North Korean forces, backed by Moscow and Beijing, crossed the 38th parallel, the United States and its allies interpreted it as a test of Western resolve. Truman ordered American troops into battle under the flag of the United Nations. The war quickly escalated into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century. Cities burned, millions died, and soldiers from dozens of nations fought on the peninsula. For the United States, it was proof that containment was not theory, but action, that communism would be resisted by force of arms. For the Soviet Union, which supplied weapons and advisors while avoiding direct confrontation, it was a way to bleed the West and to demonstrate the limits of American power. Inside America, fear of communism reached a fever pitch. The House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings that accused actors, writers, and directors of communist ties. Blacklists spread through Hollywood and the press. Senator Joseph McCarthy launched investigations that claimed to expose communist infiltration of the State Department, the Army, and even the White House. Careers were ruined, reputations destroyed, not always with evidence, but with suspicion alone. For millions of Americans, the fear was not just of Soviet armies abroad, but of subversive agents at home. The Red Scare became a daily reality, dividing communities and fueling a climate of paranoia. In the Soviet Union, the years after the war were marked by triumph and terror. Stalin stood as the unquestioned leader, celebrated as the architect of victory, the father of the nation, the genius of socialism. Statues were raised, cities renamed, propaganda flooded the press. At the same time, repression deepened. Those who had been in contact with foreigners during the war were viewed with suspicion. Intellectuals, writers, and scientists were watched, some arrested, some executed. The cult of personality reached heights never seen before. Stalin was not merely a leader. He was portrayed as infallible, omniscient, the embodiment of the Soviet people. The propaganda machine cast the United States as the new enemy, the successor to fascism, bent on surrounding and crushing socialism. Posters showed American bombs falling, American spies lurking, American generals plotting war. The message was clear: vigilance, loyalty, sacrifice. The Soviet people were told that they lived on the front line of history, that their survival depended on obedience and unity. The hardships of reconstruction, the shortages, the labor in factories and fields were framed as necessary for the defense of socialism against a hostile world. The creation of NATO in 1949 had been answered a few years later by the Warsaw Pact, uniting Eastern Europe under Soviet military command. The arms race accelerated. America built the hydrogen bomb, thousands of times more powerful than the weapons dropped on Japan. The Soviet Union soon followed. Each side measured success not by peace, but by the scale of destruction it could threaten. Strategy became a balance of terror, the belief that neither side would strike because the retaliation would destroy both. And yet, despite the fear, there was also fascination. In the United States, some intellectuals admired the scale of Soviet achievements, the speed of industrialization, the discipline of its people. In the Soviet Union, some looked to America with envy at its consumer goods, its freedom of expression, its culture of abundance. Both governments sought to suppress these sympathies, but they existed, quiet undercurrents beneath the thunder of propaganda. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had become the defining structure of world politics. Every revolution, every election, every strike was interpreted through the prism of East and West. Nations aligned with one camp or the other, or struggled to remain neutral in a world that seemed to allow no neutrality. The language of the time was filled with absolutes: freedom versus tyranny, socialism versus capitalism, good versus evil. The nuance of local realities was often lost in the grand contest. For ordinary people, the Cold War was not an abstraction. It was the presence of foreign soldiers in divided Berlin. It was the sound of jet engines overhead in Korea. It was the suspicion of neighbors in America, the whisper that someone might be a communist. It was the endless speeches of Stalin, the parades of missiles in Red Square, the drills in American schools. It was the lived reality of a generation that grew up knowing that at any moment the world might be consumed in nuclear fire. When Stalin died in March of 1953, the future was uncertain. Would his successors continue his iron grip, or would they seek accommodation? In Washington, leaders wondered if the Soviet system would soften, if coexistence was possible. In Moscow, the struggle for power began, with men like Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev maneuvering for control. The Cold War did not end with Stalin's death, but it entered a new phase, one in which the rivalry would continue for decades, reshaping not only politics but culture, science, and the very imagination of humanity. The birth of the Cold War was not a single moment, but a series of shocks. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade, the atomic bomb, the fall of China, the war in Korea, the rise of McCarthyism, the tightening grip of Stalin. Each event deepened the divide. Each response confirmed the suspicion of the other. By the middle of the 20th century, the world was locked in a contest unlike any it had ever known. Not open conquest, not traditional empire, but a struggle of ideologies, weapons, and fears, stretching across continents, oceans, and minds. This was the new reality that shaped the second half of the century. The Cold War was not cold in the lives it touched. It was hot in Korea, in the blacklists of Hollywood, in the prisons of Moscow, in the hunger of Berlin. It was a war fought not to seize land, but to define the future of humanity. And in its early years, as America and the Soviet Union faced each other across a divided world, the stage was set for decades of confrontation, compromise, and the ever-present possibility of catastrophe. Subscribe. We don't say goodbye,